Hello, Zach.
Hello, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Not bad, thank you. Sorry, just
Staying
trying to
healthy and
sort
safe?
out. Oh yeah, no problem. Just trying to sort out this bloody tripody thing. Not very good with them.
Got it?
Yeah, there we go.
Precariously balancing it on something?
Pretty much. Well, it's because the phone has to sort of be lopsided in order to do it.
Okay.
Yeah. Come
This is
on.
giving
Okay,
it a very authentic quality. Well, that's good.
that's better. That's better. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's holding up because up until then it was, unbalanced.
Right. Like so many things these days.
Oh yeah, exactly. Exactly. No. Everything's sort of all over the place, really.
Yeah. But you're doing okay. You were supposed to be in Virginia right now, right?
Yeah. I was meant to be, well, I was meant to be in Virginia, doing a garden party at Williamsburg. That was meant to be fun,
Mm-hmm.
and was going to be cool. But unfortunately, that's not happening. And then I was meant to be going from there. I was meant to be doing a few lectures in various places, and then going on to New York. And now none of that's happening. And it's just, yeah. But it's the same sort of not happeningness as everyone else, really.
That's true.
So at least it's not like I can't do it for some reason. It's because no one can do anything. So
Right.
that's some
It's not like you
consolation.
haven't been invited to the party. The party's just
Exactly.
not happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose that's a good way of putting it.
Right.
Because we all feel a bit sad for these parties and anything
Yeah.
that we sort of thought was going to go on that now isn't. And I think that's sort of what it is. It's that whole thing of not wanting to be left out, but we
Mhm.
were invited and everything, and it was, it wasn't a problem, but it's the fact that priorities have now changed.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know.
Are you in Brighton now?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh.
yeah, yeah. Home in Brighton. Whereabouts are you at the moment? Is New Orleans? Am I right in
New
saying?
Orleans. Yeah. 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 Have you been
Yeah.
here?
No, not yet. I want to come one day. Just
Well,
because.
we've got a bedroom here
Amazing.
for you whenever you want to come.
Oh, that's very sweet of you. Thank
They
you.
will love you here. They will adore you. You will be showered with beads on the street wherever you go.
Well, it was very interesting because a friend of mine went to a reenactment where they did where they reenacted the Battle of New Orleans on the 200th
Mhm.
anniversary, and he
Yeah.
went and he was walking around downtown New Orleans, the old part, but he was wearing a top hat. But
Mhm.
because of that, apparently he was walking down the street and people were crossing the road to avoid him. Apparently, it's still like a really
Huh.
it's still very much seen as a symbol by some people. I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I
and I
didn't
was
know
like,
that.
really? And he was like, yeah, walking around wearing a top hat, people were
Huh.
avoiding me because of wearing a top hat. That was like,
Do they think
okay.
it was like a voodoo thing or something?
Yeah. That
Oh, they
must be the
thought it was like
connection.
Baron Samedi or something like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting you mentioned reenactments. They did one recently here. Obviously, reenactments are quite an interesting and sometimes controversial thing. Here,
Oh,
obviously,
sure.
so many people do Civil War reenactments. And
Yeah.
recently, there was an artist who put together a reenactment of a slave rebellion,
Oh,
and with all almost entirely black cast, and they reenacted this march from some other place in Louisiana over 2 days to New Orleans, and it ended a few blocks from here in
wow.
Congo Square. And I think it was the first time anyone ever did something like a reenactment of a slave rebellion rather than some
That's
glorious
really cool.
Southern battle.
That's really cool.
It's
And
really
that's
interesting.
something that I think should be celebrated, applauded, and more of, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you've got such a there's a Christopher Hitchens once wrote an article about reenactments where he said those who forget history are doomed to reenact it. And I think sometimes you get this kind of there is this sort of golden age thinking about the past or this
Oh
glorification of
yeah,
things.
yeah. I have absolutely no time for people that look at history through rose-tinted glasses. I'm very well aware of what history was, the faults of society at the time, which is why when people say, "Oh, I love what you were. I would have loved to have lived back then." It's like
Mhm.
dentistry. toilet paper,
Mhm.
antibiotics, pregnancy, LGBT rights, minority rights. You sort of go, yeah, okay, you can love bits of it, but
Mhm.
you know, at no point, because people say, oh, it was simpler back then. There
Right.
was nothing simple about it. Okay, maybe your choices were simple in terms of
Sure.
you eat, you work, or you die.
Hmm.
So I think what people don't necessarily like about modern times is the fact that there's more paperwork involved in living
Mm.
than I think has been in the past. But yeah, it does bother me when people say, "Oh, I would have loved to have lived back then."
Hmm.
Then, if you think you would have loved to have lived back then, you don't understand history.
Yeah, and I think if you think that you would have gotten along well back then you're probably straight and white and you know,
Yeah, with lots of money.
yeah. It's interesting because I've interviewed a lot of people who are into vintage, who are into history, who are interested in
Mm.
historical dressing, and it seems like in the past several years, I see more and more people who are people of color or minorities who are getting involved in the vintage scene. And I think that
Certainly.
people who aren't involved in it are often surprised by that because they misunderstand the
Mm.
impulse behind it.
Yeah, it and I think it's very useful from a perspective of growing up where people are sort of just wearing vintage or 40s or 30s, 40s, 50s. You
Mm.
generally see it a lot. I did when I was growing up and getting into those scenes. That that section of society, the ethnically diverse side of society, wasn't represented.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think it's good that it is being presented because, in a way, with it not being presented in reenactment or in the culture,
Mm-hmm.
the subculture that dressing vintage is, what it does is it then represents it as it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have to remember that just because they're not in all the photographs of the day and everything, people of color have always been about.
Yeah.
So to somehow not paint them in the picture doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
There has always been a place for people of color in history. And by saying place, I don't mean that to sort of put people down in that way, but there's always been people of color throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, whether it's in a position of power or not, or whatever.
Yeah.
And we also have to understand that throughout history, it wasn't always the situation where anyone of color was always someone of the lower class or always a slave
Yeah.
or always a worker. There were intellectuals and people had money and people had
Yeah.
land. There were exceptions to the rule, and I think their stories should be
Mm-hmm.
promoted more rather than just lumping in every person of color from a period of history as these people are only ever slaves. Like, no, some
Yeah.
of these people were actually doctors, and some of these people actually fought their way out of slavery and out of
Mm-hmm.
bondage through learning, and that's a side of the history which I think should be um, explained a bit more, which I don't think is. But I think the conversation is changing
Mm-hmm.
because I think more people are much more open to talk about it.
I agree. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that I often see when tour groups are walking here through New Orleans, they're often really shocked to find out that not only were there a lot of free black people in New Orleans before the Civil War, but they actually owned slaves themselves quite often. And so these
Yeah.
kind of layers of things are really, I think, only now people are starting to understand that on a broader level, how complicated these things were. Um, one thing
Yeah,
that
I
occurs to
mean,
me, yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, I was going to agree and say, yeah, human civilization is in. Oh, there we go again. It is inherently complicated,
Mm-hmm.
and to tar everything with the same brush in any way never works. We can go through sort of broad speculation
Mm-hmm.
and ways of describing things, but we have to remember that there's a whole undercurrent of ordinary people with everything,
Mm-hmm.
and that with everything there is always an exception to every single rule.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting in when Rose and I did our second book where we went to other places like South Africa and Japan
Yeah.
and Germany. in places like Japan and Germany, when you meet someone who's dressing like they're from the 1930s, it has a whole other kind of connotation, obviously.
Context, completely, yeah.
So it's quite interesting getting to see that, and then meeting people in South Africa who are the first generation of young Black people who can even choose their own clothes, really, who can afford to dress themselves in the way they want.
Yeah.
So that's kind of fascinating. So when you and I first crossed paths, it was for mine Rose's first book, I Am Dandy, and unfortunately, you were one of the last people that I got to interview, so I didn't get to interview in person. I only had a very brief email exchange with you, I believe. But you told some amazing story. Well, you talked about your mother's friend David and the tailcoat that he left after he passed away, and it was a very moving story. It spoke to me about how ideas and people and relationships can live on through objects and clothing, even when it's someone you haven't known.
Yeah, exactly. You can have objects, but as soon as you attach a story, thought, or feeling to it, it then has meaning. For example, in a historical collection, there could be a tea service, and it's given a number in a museum. But when you find out that tea service was then a wedding gift by such and such person, and she writes about it in her diary, and it's those layers that give it a personality and a rooting in history, rather than just being ephemera.
Yeah.
And
when you start, sorry.
Oh no! I was just blabbing.
You were skipping there for a second, I think, but. Hello?
Yeah. No, back.
Okay.
Back.
Well, since then, you've become like a bit of a phenomenon online.
Yeah, it's been a bit weird.
How did that all come about? I mean, not only among people who like dressing or dandyism or history, but you've become sort of an icon of self-expression for a lot of people.
Yeah. No, so I mean, the main thing that really did it was the BBC clip that went really viral, and that was last year. And that was so a friend of mine worked at the BBC, and he was like, I just want to film something with you, just, so I've known him for like, nearly 10 years at this point. And he was like, you've been on stuff on the BBC before, but it was like in a different context. I want to talk about why you do what you do, self-expression wise. And I was like, okay, fine. And it was going to be a cute little thing, like after the news, just in the south of England, like very small. And we filmed it, and the BBC liked it, but because it's their intellectual property, they then went, oh, we really like that. So they thought, right, we'll promote that, because Brexit wasn't going so well at the time. And it's basically a good news story, and it really resonated with people, because the overall message of it is just do what you like, and as soon as you break down the sort of pretension and, dare I say, bullshit around this whole thing of there needs to be reasons and this and that, it's like, yeah, you can explain the reasons, but only to people that are actually worth explaining it to and worth taking the time to then listen to. Overall, it's just easier to say, well, just be yourself. Because after all, being yourself is the easiest thing, because you're already yourself. You're always in a position to know who you are. It's everyone else that you've somehow got to try and convince. But if you then make the decision of going, well, why do I need to convince anyone else, and just start doing your own thing, then you've solved the equation, really.
Do you think that effectively, having that attitude and that outlook effectively manages to convince people more? Do you find people changing their mind about you?
Oh, completely. It's all about being completely genuine about why you're doing something as well. So if I were to go out saying, oh, I do this because I like, because I'm pretentious about this or that, I just went out there very honestly and said, I do this because I like it. And what else? And that sort of made people go, oh, okay, he's not doing this for any other reason than to please himself. And it's nice. He's contributing to society by doing this and that. And what was interesting is when looking through the comments when it first went out, it was interesting because there are people saying, I watched this fully expecting to hate this guy,
Right.
but actually I love him, you know,
Yeah.
because people have a preconceived notion of, oh, a guy in a top hat must be a complete toff and completely, you know, disassociated from society and the general everyday. And it's like, no, I do a job, I do this and everything. I just like to be this way. I'm much happier doing this. And it resonates with people because so many people are towing an imaginary line that they've built for themselves or allowed society to build for them, and they're wondering why they're not happy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if changing your clothes makes you happy, then change your clothes.
Right.
You know, if out of everything we've got to deal with, if clothing is something you can do to change how you feel, well, then do it. You know, with me, it's yes, it's in a way the clothing, it's all sorts of things. But you know, as people have said, oh, you do it for attention. It's like, you know, I dress this every day when I'm at home, when I'm sick. You know, that there's no pretension to it. You know, especially with the amount of time, effort, and research I put into everything I make as well. You know, I mean, as you know, but yeah, people ask me, you know, why did it go big and all that. I'm still sort of blown over by the fact that people are interested in me doing something that I've just always been doing. You know, I don't see it necessarily as anything special because I'm just doing what I do. I don't do it to create any form of attention or anything really, which people assume it should be. But that's just really not the case. I mean, if you're going to an event or you're dressing up for something, yeah, sure, like everyone does. But day to day, no.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've met and interviewed, and I'm friends with so many people who have this impulse to dress up, to dress eccentrically, to you know, be dandies or whatever form that takes. And what struck me about your thing that went viral is the people that I saw sharing it were not part of this, you know, weird world. It was, you know,
it had a very, very broad
we all kind
appeal.
of know who it was people who you would sort of look on the street and say, okay, that's an ordinary person. But there was something about what you were doing that still resonated with them, even if dressing up wasn't their thing necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. Because the principles that came across very well in that clip, it was the principles of just be yourself. You know, I'm doing it in my vein, but do it the way you want to. You know, it's basically giving people free license to be themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's incredibly valuable, especially as people aren't necessarily. It's interesting the amount of conversations and people that came out of the woodwork and people that ended up speaking to me. People said, "You gave me so much confidence to do X, Y, Z in their life." So there was a couple that I ended up bumping into when I was up in Bath. He said, "Oh my God, it's you! Didn't know you'd be here." Da, da, da. Because my clip had inspired them to quit their jobs and start up their own business.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, that's a lot of pressure to put on me. But the business is going well. But it's that fact that the principles of self-expression and self-belief and self-confidence and being true to who you are and genuine to how you're feeling, they shouldn't just be confined to dressing. You know, they are principles which can affect all aspects of your life. And I think that once you sort of tap into those sorts of things and you become a bit more comfortable in your own skin, then everything else, I think, can fall into place a bit easier.
I saw, I mean, in fact, I saw a lot of people using this as a body positivity message.
Certainly,
I mean, that was a lot of people sharing it with that kind of thought in mind.
Yeah, completely. But because one line I sort of use a lot and I tell to people is that, you know, in bespoke, there's no such thing as size. You know, everything I make is going to be your size, you know.
Yeah.
And I said that to a woman when I was measuring her in a consultation, and she just burst into tears. You know, just
Oh, yeah.
because all her life she had been, her whole identity, her whole sense of worth and purpose had been built around numbers. And as soon as you take that out of the equation and go, no, there's no number attached to this, this is yours and it will fit you and you will feel fantastic in it, then it just changes the whole conversation.
Yeah.
And one thing we need to get people around and change the whole marketing around is that it's not the fact you don't fit the clothes don't fit you. You know, the clothes aren't made correctly for you. You know, so size 6 in that shop or size 6 in that shop or whatever. I don't know how sizes work. They're irrelevant because they're constantly changing. They mean nothing to nobody. It's just another way of, unfortunately, marketers putting people down, which is just awful.
Are you optimistic that you know, mainstream fashion can learn those lessons and implement them?
There is an undercurrent trend. I think it would take a while, if anything, but I don't necessarily know that it's going to happen anytime soon. From conversation I've had with fashion people and designers and such, there is definitely an undercurrent, and I think it's more coming up in some generation. But as long as there's that celebrity cult of the way people look, I think that's going to really, you know, I'm not terribly sure it's going to change for some time. Although one thing that may change it is this whole epidemic thing, because people aren't going out and buying clothes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So take that as a little sidetrack. One of the things you said in the original interview was that life's too short to, you know, not to dress how you want, or life's too short to wear dull clothing or something like that. Do you think now that we're sort of facing a global reckoning with mortality, people will say, well, you know, life is too short. Maybe I should be dressing up more.
Yeah. One thing that'd be fantastic if everyone comes out of this with a new sort of, not lease of life, but appreciation of the life that they have. Because I think we've all been touched by this personally with, unfortunately, the loss of relatives or people we know or friends and family, that sort of thing. And it really does bring home mortality in its actual sense. But also, if we're then all working from home and the whole business world is completely changed, I think there will be that whole thing of, one, business people going, why do I have to wear a suit? Or some people going, I love dressing up when I was at home, putting on my suit and everything every day to make me feel like I was at work, or things like that. I think it's giving people the time to explore things outside of the usual parameters, which is an opportunity. I think with everything that's going on, you need to try in some way to find things as some form of opportunity.
Yeah. It's interesting because your own style and your own version of this is based on history and very detail-oriented research and attempts to do things authentically and in a certain way. Is there any kind of, I guess, where's the crossover between what you do and your historical interest in it and the world of dressing and fashion as it is out there?
I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. Well, one thing that's quite interesting is modern advertising has very little influence on me. Modern fashion has very little insight into what I do. I'm not necessarily sure there is so much of a crossover. I'd say there's more that the modern fashion industry could perhaps learn from me and not necessarily the styles as such, but the values behind it. The use of natural fibers, the care that goes into something, the idea of longevity. So the ideals of clothing and the expense and time that should go into them and the sustainable practices. That can be done with a jacket, with a t-shirt, with everything that people wear. It would just mean a complete overhaul of the way we create things. One thing I like is the fact that, oh, I like that historical style. That's really cool. I enjoy that. And what's fun is that when you look at original fabric samples and things, you realize that there is such a huge library of wealth of fabric understanding and pattern, which we've sort of completely forgotten about and completely relegated to not being appropriate for men or not being acceptable in some way, shape or form. And it's like super fashionable in, I think February 1807 is really thick, so thick shag pile velvet. Yeah. So like really hairy teddy bear type velvet, bright orange with black polka dots. That was the fashionable material for men's waistcoats. Do you see Mr. Darcy wearing that? I think not. And once you realize that there are these idiosyncrasies and trends and ins and outs in just clothing, clothing, I think it has never been just clothing. It's a social commentary. It's society expressing how it is at the time. So to have that going on, and to have that never shown in any form of historical representation in terms of historical dramas or history, we lose that nuance of the understanding of people in history. And they become these stagnant names and pictures and concepts that have no bearing to humanity. So I think being able to understand that these people had their foibles and had their ways really lends you to understand that human nature has never really changed. And once you get that, then things like Shakespeare and Jane Austen become a little less surprising in their human understanding, because they're just writing about people. And the reason it's still relevant is because people haven't changed. The society in which they are and the technology and things like that have changed, but fundamentally people haven't changed. You still have the best in people and the worst in people, and that's been the same throughout history.
It's interesting. I've spoken to a lot of classes, university classes, both, I've spoken to English classes about Oscar Wilde, and I've spoken to design students about menswear history and dandyism. And I found that, the literature and liberal arts students are all really eager to talk about fashion history and about the philosophy behind fashion. And, they've read Zola and want to talk about department stores and stuff. And then when I sit down with the design students, they kind of can't wait to get back to the studio. And they're not really as eager to learn about the history as one would hope.
I think that's something to do with the avenues moving on from their degree. The design students, their life is going to be based on what they can make, what they can produce, and where they're going forward. The understanding for them can come later in their musings of security. Once they've got themselves secure in a job or an industry where they're putting out the things that people expect them to, and that's going great, then they can design, then they can sit down and read, then they can express. Some do, some never do. And I think that's where the fundamental change is, because of the way the industry's built. I think if the industry were completely different and you could theorize a bit more or allow people the space, I think the way in which these degrees push people is towards the modern manufacture and the modern way of making things and doing things, and the unsustainable way, which in itself is unsustainable. So you can't keep training people and building people up to an industry which is not going to exist very soon. Because if it's going to be torn down and people are wanting to revolutionize the fashion industry, don't train them up for a fashion industry that isn't going to be there.
Yeah.
And saying to designers, oh, push it, do this, do that. It's like, what do people actually want? And what do you want to do? What do you want to express? There's that whole thing of practicality and fun. And you very rarely see designers dipping into history
Mm.
in that way, because it's seen as going back and it's not
Right.
innovative. But it's probably at the moment one of the most innovative things you can do, because no one else is doing it.
Mm.
You know, how about you go right back into history and go, oh, actually, if we change that about the way we construct our sleeves, that will actually give you a wider range of movement and give you a much nicer silhouette. You just don't see people revisiting history and realizing, why have we left certain things behind and what can we learn from the past? I mean, one thing I wish that would come in, back again, would probably be a higher, tighter arm size.
Mm-hmm.
Because then everyone's coats would just fit a lot better. It's just one of my bugbears.
I think people have sometimes they have a mistaken view of progress, where they think that it's kind of, it's that it must be survival of the fittest. Like, all the stuff that we've left behind must have not been very good. They think that, oh, well, what we've got now is probably here because it's the most efficient or the easiest or the best.
Yeah.
And
then politics says, oh, wasn't it better back then?
Yeah, right.
It's a complete oxymoron.
I'm glad that there are, there's people, young people like you, but there also are a few kind of keepers of the flame, like Hamish Bowles, who you met when you were in New York, who are sort of crucial to preserving that link between
Vivienne Westwood
history.
as well.
Sorry?
Vivienne Westwood as well.
Vivienne
Continuing
Westwood,
the punk flame.
And even in America, Ralph Lauren is kind of the keeper of American fashion history. And I often meet a lot of people who are particularly in the world of sort of tailored menswear and what's called classic menswear, sort of 1930s thing. And they always make that, they're quite disdainful of the idea of fashion. They say, oh, this is style, not fashion. And I've come to sort of understand fashion is actually just a chronology of style. Fashion is the history of people's individual choices. And I don't think people think of it that way. But anyway, I was wondering, when people buy your work, when you have clients, are they usually looking for a full, authentic costume, or do they want pieces to incorporate with other things?
Generally speaking, when people come to me, I'm not sure of percentages, but sometimes people have never bought anything historical and they want to go to, bless them, they say, the best to sort of have the whole thing done. They want the full wardrobe. So there's some that do that, and there's some that maybe want a waistcoat or, the odd bit and piece. So, but generally speaking, I find it better to be able to do a full suit or an outfit, because then it gives people an idea of the choice and the customization and the way in which they can really change a bespoke piece. And I will always persuade people to go, okay, right, you're a gentleman. Your wife has been doing, generally the wife has been doing historical reenactment or balls for years and has dragged you along to a few and rented things, or you've worn like black tie and you felt it out of place or whatever. And you need an outfit that's going to work and live with you for the next X number of years. And I go, okay. Generally, you're looking at balls, but how many day things are you doing? I'm like, okay. So what you want is a pair of breeches, two waistcoats, and a tailcoat. You want a darker tailcoat so that you can go in the day and evening, so it's appropriate. You want a pair of breeches, probably in like a cashmere, so that you can wear it in the day with like pumps or maybe boots. But then certainly in the evening, you can wear the breeches. And then you want like a wool or a linen waistcoat for the day, and then a fancy silk one for the evening. So the thing with a men's outfit is that I've had clients come back and just order a waistcoat to go with what I've already made them, because a man puts on a waistcoat, he's suddenly got a whole new outfit. That's never changed. You have it in tailors' documents and archives of such and such having a waistcoat made as of the waistcoat made on May the 8th or whatever, and it's that whole thing of new waistcoat, suddenly a whole new outfit. So generally speaking, I find that people are looking for a whole suit. Sometimes people are looking for like one piece, as in when people are looking for a one piece, it tends to be like a coat, like maybe an overcoat or a garret coat or even a banyan.
Mm-hmm.
But people generally aren't coming along saying, I just want a waistcoat. People are
Mm-hmm.
maybe looking for a waistcoat and breeches and maybe going, I'll look at the tailcoat later on, you know, and it's fine, you know, to have these steps up. And when you say to someone, you know, here are all of your options and you can choose all of these, it's sort of, it's that treasure trove that people are never used to, you know?
Mm-hmm. The banyan is one of your most exciting pieces, and it seems to be the one that you have the most fun wearing. Could you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah. Well, banyan, it's basically a fancy 18th century, you know, silk dressing gown. It is it's the mainstay of gentlemen at leisure, of philosophers, musicians, anyone that wants to be vaguely loose and
Mm.
intellectual. But it's just there isn't a modern equivalent. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you get home and you chuck on what you probably change out of everything you're wearing, but to put on maybe a looser, more extravagant coat isn't
Mm-hmm.
maybe something you do. So it's a very interesting way of doing it. But I love them because it's a perfect way in which nowadays we're so obsessed with loungewear. I'm just obsessed with the loungewear of 200 years ago, which is much more exciting
Mm.
because it's loungewear, but also formal enough because of the material and the tailoring side of it that you are then in a position where you can receive guests and business acquaintances and
Mm.
that sort of thing in your own home. So it's very much a gentleman at leisure type thing. And the term banyan, of course, everyone knows the banyan tree. Funnily
Mm-hmm.
enough, no connection. It
Mm.
basically comes from one theory is it comes from the garments worn by the merchants in the docks in India. They'd wear their garments which are called a banya.
Okay.
They'd wear the garments called a banya. And it was basically the merchants of the East India Company and the people selling the stuff to the West thought,
Mm-hmm.
oh, if we give it an exotic name and call it banyan instead of like robe or housecoat, it
Right.
will suddenly become exotic and people will want to buy it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's been the same throughout history. Give something a fun, interesting name, you know, put a fun label on it and people will buy it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
stick Louis Vuitton on something and people will buy it in droves. Stick Supreme on a Coke can and everyone will buy it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it it's a tale as old as time.
Yeah. It's I assumed it was Indian in origin because it looks so much like a kurta or a shalwar. Um,
Exactly.
yeah.
It has its origins from all over, as they would say, the Orient,
Okay.
aka everything past the Cape.
Yeah.
And it was to do with, you know, it first had its main emphasis from the kimono, but then, of course, there's the Indian jama and the Turkish kaftan, and all
Mm-hmm.
of these robes of, see, well, not so much the jama, but the more loose kimono and the kaftan, they'd be, you know, you'd sit and you'd have, you know, you'd sit with your pipe and with sweetmeats and you entertain guests. And it was that whole idea of bringing the exoticness of the Orient somehow back to the drab country homes of Western Europe.
Mm. When was
And
it?
it went wonders.
When was it first popular?
It first really hits the scene in like the 1680s. And
Oh
that's
wow.
the very loose kimono style. And tailoring at that point, still tailoring, but it's a very different silhouette. It's very up down because it's that very sort of just put on at the shoulders, everything draped.
Mm.
And then you get to the 1700s and the style changes. Everything becomes a lot more tailored around the body. Everything becomes a lot closer. The silhouette changes.
Mm.
The mid 1700s, mid 18th century, you have the wider skirts, and you see banyans and things like that developing around that line as well. And
Mm.
after all, banyans are incredibly practical. At home, you wouldn't wear your coat around all day. So you've been out and about wearing your coat all day, maybe with an overcoat. You come back
Mm.
home, there's maybe a fire in your main parlor, a fire in the dining room, and then maybe a fire in your bedroom. If you're wealthy enough, if you're lucky enough, if you have enough servants to keep it going.
Right.
Otherwise, you are a banyan. It's a socially acceptable coat and a socially acceptable duvet. I mean, it's great. It's like wearing a socially acceptable duvet. It really is. Because this one's quilted. So generally it wouldn't just be
wow.
single layers. It would
Yeah.
be, silk, then interlined with wool, and then with a pattern underneath or a plain fabric. However, on the flip side, you've got very loose, light banyans made of like printed cotton, a single layer of printed cotton with like a silk facing, which you might wear in Virginia in the summer.
Yours looks more structured than a caftan does, but I assume that's probably just because of the stiffer silk, partly.
Some and some. So this is more of a structured. So the one I'm wearing now is more structured. I've got another one which is from about 1810 in style, and that's a more structured one, but a lot softer. So this is of a silk, taffeta, and satin weave. So it's got that body to it. But in my other one, it's a looser one of a sort of silk and cotton ottoman. And then the other one I've got is just silk lined with linen, and it's much looser. It's the much more kimono style. And I'm planning on doing another one, which is going to be the summer weight Virginia style.
Okay. You'll bring that one to New Orleans.
Yeah, exactly. And it was totally acceptable in the tropics, or basically anywhere it was warm, to wear breeches and your banyan. No waistcoat, maybe a cravat. And it was that whole thing of everyone realized that it was like, this person's a gentleman because that printed cotton he's wearing, we know it's expensive. The buckles on his shoes, yeah, they're expensive. He's wearing good shoes. Yeah, he's just wearing a shirt and not a waistcoat because it's friggin' hot outside. No one's going to chuck another waistcoat on top of that. That's when the nuance changes. And people suddenly think, oh, he's not wearing all this. He's not properly dressed up. He's not a gentleman. Once you understand social history, you then understand why clothing was the way it was. And they're not separate entities. So understanding clothing gives you an insight into society, and understanding society gives you an insight into architecture and furnishings and the ephemera of the household and political ideas and literature. No thing in history ever stands alone. It's always wrapped up in the time in which it is created. So when people get a snippet of history and they put it in isolation without context, it makes no sense. It's a bit like saying, let's take Tamagotchis and just talk about Tamagotchis. Let's talk about why Tamagotchis even existed,
right,
and the whole thing around them, and why society built up that they should become a thing. Part of the notion of Tamagotchis is the fact that people had mobile phones with little clips in them, so you could attach the Tamagotchi to your phone, and it was like, in the ephemera side of things, it was like wearing a fob, and it is called a fob in a way. So it would be interesting in sort of 200-300 years to look at the way in which you and I of the future are talking about now.
Right.
That'd be fun.
Yeah. One of my favorite sort of facts that I tell people when I'm talking to classes and stuff is people think that people dressing in vintage or historical styles is like a new thing. And I point out that Oscar Wilde was wearing knee breeches, a couple hundred years after those had completely gone out. And that I think this looking back at past styles is something that you often see in people with dandyish tendencies. I'm
not sure it's just people with... See, it's this interesting dichotomy. I mean, saying just dandyish tendencies, people just wanting to escape the society in which they're built in some way. I think through that, one of the best and easiest ways, not easiest, but one of the best ways is through dandyism. And it's interesting to see how the interpretation of dandyism changes from generation to generation and from context and subculture as well. It's interesting people saying, I bumped into someone a few months ago obviously before all this, who was walking around town and he was wearing like a tweed jacket, jeans, and a scarf, and said, "Oh, I'm called quite the dandy." It's like, you know, your
Right.
friends call you dandy, and it's like. Also, another thing, I hate. No, I hate. Yeah, no, I hate. I'm going to put that up there. I hate people that call themselves dandies.
Yeah.
You aren't a dandy.
Right.
You are just a person. You don't call yourself a dandy. Other people call you a dandy. It's not a title you bestow yourself. It's a title you're given. You know.
This is something Rose and I encountered a lot when we interviewed people. We asked them how they felt about that label and whether that they felt it was appropriate to call themselves that. I've come to make
wait till you've been called it a few times, and then you go, okay, maybe.
Yeah, I always call myself an aspiring dandy or a dandyologist. I find that I make a distinction between lowercase d and capital D dandies. I feel like capital D dandies are people like Hamish or like Oscar Wilde, and then lowercase d dandies are just well-dressed guys, you know.
You know, people jumping out of that awful modern cardboard box of beige. You know, those, hate to say it, those straight men who are told for years and years that dressing in such a way is gay, or dressing in such a way is effeminate, or dressing in some ways somehow not cool, or whatever. And it's like, some of the best womanizers throughout history have been flashy dresses. I'm
That's
like,
true.
my God.
Yeah.
You know, me as a gay guy having to teach straight guys that no. Women prefer that, you know, the amount of female attention I've received is staggering. Absolutely staggering. And it is that whole thing of just being yourself, and how somehow society and the toxic side of masculinity has prevented people from just being themselves.
Yeah.
In some way in which men showing emotion through any form except anger and competitiveness is seen as something they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it definitely varies from culture and region to region.
Completely.
You know, I find that I get a lot more complimentary attention from young black men as opposed to young white men, who are usually kind of rather threatening. But
that's
also,
young white men throughout history.
Yeah. I've certainly had more abuse hurled at me from young white men than from young black men. But it's interesting. I was going to say, do you know who Dr. Pottsy is?
Pardon, say that again?
Dr. Pottsy? P-O-Z-Z-I? I
don't, I'm afraid. No.
Okay. There's a new biography of him. He was the most famous gynecologist in Paris. And there's a famous portrait of him by John Singer Sargent, where he's wearing this very, very loose red dressing gown and sort of twirling the tassel.
Yes, and I do know that painting.
Yes. He was, as being the greatest gynecologist in Paris, he was also basically sleeping with every married woman in Paris.
I mean, those poor upper-class women with nothing else to do but embroider every cushion in their Parisian apartments.
It's like a little excitement.
Yeah, it's like, oh, what are you doing today? Well, I decided, darling, we need a new wing to the house. It's like, why? I've embroidered everything in this wing of the house. I've embroidered everything. I've wallpapered everything. There's cabinets on cabinets and trinkets upon trinkets. We need a whole other wing because you will not sleep with me.
Yeah. I've embroidered the baby.
I invented tattooing on the child.
Yeah. Well, actually, you know, when you come stay here, when you come visit New Orleans, and you stay in our apartment, you'll be staying in the apartment where she was born.
No.
Yes. So we live in Madame X's house.
And of course the painting was altered from the original.
Sorry?
Because the painting that now hangs is altered from the
Oh
original
yes,
paint.
she used to have the strap off.
Right all the way off, you know.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, it's scandalous. It's like all it took was that to change society. All it was a strap doing that.
Yeah.
Mental.
We've got a few more, just a couple more minutes, and I wanted, when I first met you, your style was more late Victorian. Why have you gone further back?
Simply because I developed the skills and the opportunity. So the clothing I had was clothing that I picked up. I was really happy with. I loved it, but there was like something missing. I mean, the late Victorian period isn't exactly known for its extravagance. I mean, there are extravagant pieces, but it was that whole thing of, I love it. It's a great style, but I just wanted to try something different. And as soon as I had the ability from, well, what started out was repairing stuff, and then it was making my own cravats, and then it was making things that I couldn't afford. And then it was that whole thing of, okay, I can now make waistcoats and I can now make a coat. Let's now see what I can do. And it's just sort of burgeoned on from that, really. Especially as there is no one else, I don't think, doing what I'm doing. I mean, not that I do it to be the only one. I don't do it to be the only one.
I mean, I feel like you'd know if anyone else was. I think you would have found each other.
Yeah. As in, I don't think anyone else is doing it. You know, there are people that are reenactors or that dress it a lot because they're reenacting or they're working in a historic place or something like that. But
costume
in terms of wearing it, but in terms of wearing it every day and it's become their life, there isn't really anyone else that does it. In fact, when I was doing it Victorian, there wasn't really many people or really anyone else necessarily my age or really doing Victorian. There was more people doing 40s, 50s, some in the 60s. You may find people doing 20s and 30s, but mainly it was like post-Edwardian. It was basically sinking of Titanic onwards.
Right.
You know, so even when I was doing Victorian, there wasn't really anyone else doing it. There'd be people that might do it for an event or do it the weekend, but people that weren't doing it the whole time.
Right.
You know,
or they would do some gothic pastiche or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that has its place. That you know, steampunk and goth, they have their place completely. It's just not for me. So that's why I sort of stick to what I'm doing, really.
Yeah, I absolutely adore Regency style and don't own anything remotely like it because it seems so inaccessible.
See, that's
like
the problem.
You're one of the only people doing it.
It's not off the peg. Yeah. And there are people that make it. There are historical costumiers, or, well, when I say historical costumiers, there's generally reenactors that do the making as a hobby on the side. There are very few. I mean, like I can think of, I can't actually think of anyone else that does making period clothing historically accurately is their job.
Right.
You know, apart from the tailors, obviously at Colonial Williamsburg and places like that, but that's like they're interpreters as well, and they are communicating with the public. Rather than me, it's just me in my workshop making the stuff. Yeah. So in a way, I've built a niche for myself. You know, build it, and people will come, I suppose, is the sort of way in which you do these things. Yeah.
Where do you buy your Hessian boots?
So I've bought Hessian boots from Andy Burke, who is a really good historical shoemaker in the UK. Amazing bootmaker and shoemaker. His level of research and understanding is fantastic. And like the stuff he'll tell you over a pint is phenomenal. Really interesting. But also I've got pairs of shoes from American Duchess. American Duchess shoes are fantastic because they are accessible. They're accessible shoes that you can buy. They're comfortable, they are everyday, and they are an absolute delight. As with everything, you can go to different suppliers for different things and for different levels. You know, there's the everyday, there's the special things, and there's the wedding version. you know, which is always the most expensive or whatever. So you can go to bespoke shoemakers and spend, you know, 400-500 pounds, you know, $600 on something, or you can go somewhere else and spend, you know, a certain amount on something else. You know, there are varying levels in everything. So at the moment, I'm buying them. Well, I've got as many as I need, but do I have as many as I want? No. That's why I'm now in talks with a guy that makes folkwear dance shoes in Hungary.
Oh, wow.
Because the shoe style hasn't changed for their folk dancing in over like 200 years. And that style is the same style of shoe. So I'm talking to them about, could you make this? And then if that's the case, fantastic. You know, and plus I'm sort of like going, cool, I'm keeping a heritage craft alive, which no matter what you say against big brands like Chanel or Armani, there's their front of house, there's their worldwide brand, and then there's the atelier side of things. They're the ones keeping the small crafts alive, like Chanel keeping small Parisian passementier companies in business through ordering sequins and things like that, you know, or the way that things. So the couture side of things, and I'm all about keeping things alive, because a few generations it'll be gone. You know, there's only one that I know of proper trained corsetier left, Mr. Pearl. He was trained by two 90-year-old corsetiers in Paris about 50 years ago. And he is, you know, so he's that last bastion of the way in which, you know, and these 90-year-old ladies, they were making Victorian corsets. So it's that level of that expertise, understanding of why things are made the certain way that they are. And I find all of this deeply, deeply fascinating. Yeah. And the fact that... Oh, sorry. No, it's just I had an extension cord and it fell off the table I had it balanced on. The fact that... One thing I want to say is that clothing in the past had a lot to say because there was so much of yourself put into it. Clothes nowadays have nothing to say. They're completely silent. You know, you buy something and it's just... Yeah. You can put your own spin on it and then it begins to talk. But yeah, clothes nowadays, there's no nuance. There's no sort of... You're wearing that colour because it's new and expensive, and Lady Hamilton was wearing it at the recent garden party because it's scandalous or something. Right. Yeah. You know, so that level of intrigue has sort of disappeared. Yeah. Well, you're doing your part to keep it alive, and I'm glad. I could talk to you about this for hours and hours and hours, but we're about to get cut off, I think. No, probably, yeah. I think it's disappearing slightly. Thank you so much for this, Zach. This was such a pleasure. And, no, not at all. And sorry for just talking at you the whole time. No. This is why I've done this. I want people to talk at me. When this is all done and people can travel again, please, you have an open invitation to New Orleans. Oh, that's very, very kind of you. And I'll probably take you up in the offer sometime next year, because it's like I've such an itch to just go everywhere now. Yeah. Good. Well, night. Enjoy the evening. Enjoy your weekend. You too. Lovely to talk to you. Bonne nuit.